It's the week ending Saturday the 22nd of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen chaos in the UK school exam system, Belarus President Lukashenko booed off stage in Minsk, and Apple becoming the first US company valued at $2 trillion. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Gabriel Power and Joe Evans, and Kalu Calais from the Week Junior. It is editor Felicity Capon. Joe, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week Thai students became vocal about He Must Not Be Named.
We shouldn't have to speak using symbols. Direct discussion is best. That's what I think, so I choose to speak directly, out of respect for my own dignity, for that of the listeners, and for the monarchy as an institution. I just want to say that to speak out about the institution of the monarchy is something we can do.
Two students addressing a rally held last week in Thailand. So, Joe, young people openly protesting the Thai monarchy. That's new.
Absolutely. So thousands of protesters have staged a series of anti-government rallies, but the biggest one was this week. The Metropolitan Police Bureau in Thailand estimates that it was around 12,000 people, but policemen on the ground have said that it was far more, maybe around 20,000. If that's the correct figure, it would be the largest gathering in Thailand since the military coup in 2014. It's discernibly an anti-government process that the campaigners and the demonstrators would like a revised constitution. But very interestingly, and the thing that's made it a very sensitive subject in Thailand, is that they're also calling for reform of the monarchy, which under Thai law is absolutely unheard of and can lead to incredibly long prison sentences.
Yeah, 15 years, I understand, potentially, just for even mentioning that you're opposed to the monarchy.
Yes, absolutely. So there's been almost daily student-led demonstrations over the last few weeks. Say that again. And one of the things they're asking for is a redrafting of the constitution. The current constitution is Thailand's 20th since 1932 and was drafted at the military's behest and adopted in 2016. When it comes to the monarchy, they're demanding a monarchy that's actually accountable to the country's elected institutions. They also want more oversight of the way the monarchy can use public funds and that stays out of politics and the military. I've just said they've had a large number of constitutions in Thailand's history, but in every single constitution, it's been stated that the king shall be revered. Nobody shall expose the king to any sort of accusation or action. It's called the lèse-majesté law, and essentially it means that anybody criticising the royal family can be subject to secret trials or, as you say, 15 years in jail.
But really, Felicity, they're democracy protesters, aren't they? And obviously, don't get me wrong, I realise that the monarchy in some sense is something that is entirely diametrically opposite to democracy in the true sense. But I do wonder whether these students are including the monarchy in their rhetoric, not because they care that much about the king. All Thais are taught to respect the monarchy from birth, aren't they? But actually, they just want to do some attention grabbing. We're going to take on a taboo here. Listen to us when it comes to our thoughts about the government.
That's absolutely right. And I think the most striking aspect of it for me has been that it has been young people who are mobilising in huge numbers. And some of the features of the protests are really interesting. You're seeing a lot of popular culture and movie references in the ways they're protesting. As Joe alluded to in his tease at the start of this, they're using Harry Potter spells and the three-fingered salute from the Hunger Games, the dystopian series that was this worldwide phenomenon. They're using that, and even school children at school who have to sing the national anthem before they start their school day have been using this three-fingered salute. Another thing is protesters singing a Thai version of Do You Hear the People Sing from Les Mis, which interestingly enough was also used in the Hong Kong protests. So I think that's interesting. Like you said, it is a sort of pro-democracy protests wanting to not to get rid of the monarchy but to reform it, which I think is another interesting aspect. And you're seeing these influences from elsewhere like Hong Kong, possibly from the protests over George Floyd's death in the US. It does seem to be young people who are bringing this about.
And these memes, Joe, the Hunger Games, Harry Potter, is that a way of getting around censorship? Is that why they're doing it?
It started out as that, as the clip at the beginning alluded to. It's now become so blatant what they're talking about that it's, I think, maybe not necessarily the point anymore. But yeah, that was originally the intention. The intention was because language around the monarchy is so heavily legislated against and so heavily policed. The idea was that you could lean on these popular culture references as a way of making yourself seem slightly more innocent than you were. And as Felicity says, when it's younger people making these references, it could very easily be misconstrued for just a genuine reference to the pop culture.
Now, Gabriel, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Thai Prime Minister Chen Archa says the majority of Thai people do not support the protesters. However you look at it, even if it is 20,000 people, clearly that isn't the majority of the Thai people, is it? They're not out on the streets. How significant do you think these protests actually are?
The ramifications of the protests are somewhat secondary to the idea of just protesting in general. It feels calling for the reform of the monarchy would be too controversial to get everybody on side, and calling for a total overhaul of the government will see them met with military force like they were in 2014, or protesters often are around the world. One thing we haven't mentioned is that the protests are also based around the dissolution of the Future Forward party in the country, which was a kind of centre-left party that was very popular among youth voters, among young voters, and they were dissolved by the Constitutional Court because they violated election laws, apparently, by accepting a loan from their leader, which obviously the legal aspects of that case have yet to come entirely to the fore. It seems that was a spark that has set off wider dissatisfaction with other aspects of Thai society, particularly the current king, who only came to power in 2016 and is far less popular than his father, who ran the country for 70 years from 1946 until his death.
I think it's also worth pointing out that he is one of the world's richest monarchs now and has been consolidating his wealth. That's been a big part of it. But also under the pandemic, I think he's been spending most of his time in Europe, in either Germany or France, and hasn't been really there. And I imagine it's one thing to live under this authoritarian monarchy if things get done, but if a pandemic comes along and this kind of ineptitude and inequality is on show and the monarch is missing, that's when you start to get slightly angry. I think the other thing, just going back to my original point about this being a youth rebellion, I think it transcends Thailand, and that I was thinking about it in this country with the whole A-level results fiasco. Not only have you had a pandemic and there's going to be dwindling job opportunities for a lot of young people who have already had a really awful lockdown experience, you've then got the A-level results fiasco, you've got climate change, you've got the aftermath of a financial crash. I genuinely think in the next 10 years that you will see youth revolts and youth rebellions like we've never seen before.
Yeah, I do wonder the extent to which, Joe, this puts a spotlight on problems that exist in Thailand and have existed anyway, were exacerbated by COVID-19, because they've actually managed a pretty impressive containment of the virus, haven't they? But part of that has been shutting down tourism, which has really exposed the wealth gap between rich and poor in Thailand.
Yes, and Thailand was hugely impressive actually in its coronavirus response, but as you say, suffered the economic consequences of doing so. The he who must not be named in this example is King Mahavajiralongkorn, who, as Gabe says, is far less popular than his father. He made headlines sort of around the world last year when he removed his wife after 3 months of her being royal consort and accused her of disloyalty at the time, which to many sort of summed up his rule, really, that he's a very whimsical king of a sort of, as you may have had in Western countries of old. I think the reason these protests are quite interesting is because Thailand, first of all, is very unstable. They've had a series of coups over the last sort of 100 years, since the end of absolute royal rule in the early 30s. Protests are putting the government under strain. They've got an economic element as well, in that Thailand does have the worst economic outlook in Asia, according to the World Bank. And while, as you say, it escaped the brunt of the pandemic, it has been pummeled economically, and millions of people are out of work. It's also interesting because Thailand's a very newly industrialised country. It's, I think, the 8th largest economy in Asia. And it's a big, rapidly industrialising country, bang smack in the middle of the Southeast Asian chessboard, that's sort of uniquely exposed to China and the new China. And I think a move towards democracy, or big democracy protests in that region of the world, in what is being referred to as the sort of dawn of the Chinese century, are very interesting and could potentially be a huge moment for the continent if successful, or if suppressed, will be a sort of indication of the way that the region will go.
Also, to put Mahavajiralongkorn's reign into perspective, when he was prince, he did once make his miniature poodle Fufu Chief Marshal of the Air Force.
Felicity, I don't know how to segue to you from Fufu, but you're up next after this. OK, Felicity, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week that feminists got into a muddle over Middlemarch?
Yes, I will see him, said Dorothea. Pray tell him to come. What else was there to be done? There was nothing that she longed for at that moment except to see Will. The possibility of seeing him had thrust itself insistently between her and every other object. And yet she had a throbbing excitement like an alarm upon her, a sense that she was doing something daringly defiant for his sake.
Actor Dan Stevens smouldering his way through Middlemarch by George Elliot. You can see the full seductive performance as part of the carte noire moment. That's the thing. So, Felicity, what's the story?
The story is that Middlemarch is to be published for the first time in almost 150 years under George Eliot's real name, which was Mary Ann Evans. And that will be part of a collection alongside 24 other historic works by women whose writing was only ever printed under male pseudonyms. Another example is Fatima Farahani, who published poems in Iran in the 19th century under a male pseudonym, and there are many others. And it's celebrating the Women's Prize for Fiction. It's sponsored by Baileys, and it has caused a massive controversy.
Under what lines?
Under a few, really. A lot of commentators are unhappy with the idea of removing agency from these historic, long-dead authors and deciding that George Eliot will now be known as Mary Ann Evans, as if we're doing her a massive favour, whereas actually it was very ambiguous as to where the name George Eliot came from and how she felt about it. And actually a lot of sources say that she really liked the name. She liked the fact that no one knew whether she was male or female or her real identity. And also we know that a lot of Victorian women did write under their names, Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft. So there's a lot of debate about whether it's helpful at all for us to look back and decide what name these authors should be given.
And what else?
There's more. So the series has been criticised for, so another in the series is The Life of Martin R. Delaney by Frances Rowland Whipper, who was the first African American to publish a biography in 1868 under the pseudonym Frank A. Rodin. However, the cover that Baileys used unfortunately shows the silhouette of Frederick Douglass rather than Delaney. And there's other things, like I think they also said originally that it was 25 novels, and actually it's not novels, there is a biography. So it just seems like it's been really badly put together and just a bit sloppy with the details.
On that last point, Gabriel, it is an ad agency that's put this together rather than a publisher, isn't it? That's the problem, isn't it? They're looking for a press release here. Oh, look at all these women that used to write under male pseudonyms. Isn't that interesting? Haven't we changed? And they're not really thinking about the detail. That's a mistake that companies never seem prepared to learn. Do your research, think carefully, employ someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at it from a kind of corporate perspective, because Baileys and Diageo, the company that owns Baileys, which is masterminding the whole thing, Diageo is known for having quite good representation of women at a corporate level. So they do take representation and diversity quite seriously. So
it's obviously well-intentioned.
Yeah, it's just unusual that they not exactly botched this, but didn't really seem to put quite enough time into it as they perhaps should have done. They also didn't really seem to clarify to most people that they're not prints that you can buy. They're mostly ebooks. They're donating print versions to libraries, but for the public, it's just ebooks that are available, which is a shame because the designs, the aesthetics, apart from obviously putting Frederick Douglass on one of the covers by accident, they look really good. And so it just feels like a massive missed opportunity.
Joe, what do you think about the substance of the issue at hand, though? The reason this took off as a sort of social media story is because people have views on whether or not it's right to put a woman's real name on the cover when she wrote under a nom de plume.
Yeah, I think maybe masterminded is slightly too strong a word to use for the people that came up with this idea, because it just seems to me that there wasn't a single call to a scholar that studies any of these people, and that might have been quite a useful thing to do. One of the most prominent examples is Vernon Lee, whose real name was Violet Paget, who wrote Hauntings and Phantom Love and things like that. Scholars of the author suggest that one of the reasons that she adopted a male name and dress was because it was a genuine expression of her sexuality and gender, and that she adopted a persona to live her life in the way that she chose to live it in a slightly more socially restrictive period. it would have taken one phone call to a scholar of the author to find that out, and perhaps to realise that what you were doing was slightly heavy-handed. But as you rightly point out, Ollie, it is ad agency, and I think that maybe this was done slightly more with the intention of getting a press release out of it and creating some dialogue, which, of course, by talking about it, we've absolutely played into.
Yeah, what's your view, Felicity?
I completely agree with everything that's been said, really. I think it was botched. I don't think it's helpful. I think there are myriad reasons why authors choose to take the names that they take. Victorian male novelists often took female pseudonyms. Also, I think the idea that authors have always wanted to, not always, but a lot of authors want to separate their personal identity and self from their professional writing one. And that, again, could be for all sorts of reasons. A sort of like more modern example is obviously J.K. Rowling, and whereas she did choose to write under J.K. Rowling because she wanted it to be ambiguous as to whether she was male or female, she then chose an alter ego later on as Robert Galbraith, and that was conflating the name of her political hero Robert F. Kennedy with her childhood fantasy name Ella Galbraith.
I think it should also be said that people did know that a lot of these people were well known to have been women at the time. It's not like they were brilliantly disguised. George Sand is one of the people in this series who was a woman, obviously, which is why I bring it up. And Victor Hugo, the very famous French author, spoke at her funeral. It wasn't a massive surprise to people that these were
you were about to say
women.
Victor Hugo was a woman then. That would have been exciting. I didn't know that
plot
one.
twist, Victor Hugo is a woman.
Gabriel.
Yeah, George Elliot's real identity as Mary Ann Evans was revealed in 1859, by which point she'd only written one novel. And she lived for another 21 years after that using the pen name George Elliot, including when she wrote Middlemarch. So it's clear that she wanted to be known by this. Obviously, that doesn't apply to all the people here. There are a lot of people who would have felt like they were forced to change their name. But there are a lot of people who wouldn't. There are a lot of people who would have done so out of choice. Like, for instance, you do run the risk of, say, dead naming someone. If they change their name based on their gender identity, then you would run the risk of stripping them of the name that they wish to know themselves by. And it feels a little outdated to imply that this sort of masculine identity undermines feminist work.
It does feel a bit like we're having a sort of English literature seminar here. We are a current affairs show. The point about this story is not what happened 150 years ago and why a female author would choose to have an ambiguous name. The point about this story being interesting now, surely, Felicity, is that there are so many discussions going on about gender and gender identity and women in particular on social media. And it seems like sometimes people feel that's an easy win just to tap into it and don't appreciate the complexity of what's going on.
I think that's a big part of this, and I think it's almost become trendy and fashionable to jump on this bandwagon. And obviously, the complexities of the reality of the situation are far more nuanced, obviously. And it does seem to me emblematic of this sort of wider, vaguer, like liberal feminism, which is a bit tokenistic and it's easily commodifiable and fluffy, and it's got nothing to do really with the big feminist fights of the day, like resolving the gender pay gap or female representation. Or as I was delving into this, you were thinking, like, what did we need to do this? Like, of all the things, of all the real things that actually need addressing right now, I'm not sure this is one of them. And there's been a big flap over it, and we're all, like you said, it's almost like an English literature seminar. But where does this get us? There's something quite frustrating about it, I think, from a feminist point of view.
I suppose the point of it was to say the prize for fiction for women is about celebrating women's voices because before that prize existed, they seemed marginalised and uncelebrated. And if you go back through history, women have always written books, and maybe that hadn't been recognised either. On the main cause, Felicity, where do you think we are? Do you think now, 25 years into this prize, women's voices are being better heard?
I don't know. I read an interesting article saying that women actually dominated the literary marketplace as both readers and writers for the majority of the 19th century, and almost suggesting that now our gender imbalances and inequalities are being used and projected back on history at a time when actually it was a lot better for women. George Elliot, as we've talked about, was a towering literary figure. It's almost patronizing to suggest that she needs our help. It's more like we need our help, and we need these other figures from history to right the imbalances that we've got today. So it's very ironic.
Okay, Gabriel, you're up next after this. Gabe, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Scientists have discovered the spitting image of ourselves a long time ago in a galaxy far away.
Are we the only living things in the entire universe? The observable universe is about 90 billion light-years in diameter. There are at least 100 billion galaxies, each with 100 to 1,000 billion stars. Recently, we've learned that planets are very common too. And there are probably trillions and trillions of habitable planets in the universe, which means there should be lots of opportunity for life to develop and exist, right? But where is it? Shouldn't the universe be teeming with spaceships?
And explain a video about the Fermi paradox. You can find the whole thing on the Kurzgesagt YouTube channel. Gabriel, what is the story?
This week, scientists at the Atacama Large Millimeter/Submillimeter Array in Chile, known as ALMA for short, confirmed that they have discovered the presence of a previously unknown galaxy that bears a striking resemblance to our Milky Way, which they have dubbed SPT SJ041839, as scientists are wonderfully imaginative when it comes to naming things.
That's funny because I'd actually written down the name from the Vice article that I saw, and I had SPT0418-4.
Oh, no.
So there must be variables. Anyway, they'd be better off choosing a word. We get the point.
Okay, yeah, SPT, we'll call it. But while the sighting of a previously undiscovered galaxy is nothing out of the ordinary, this new discovery changes things a bit because it lies about 12 billion light years away from Earth. And thus, so for most of modern astronomical history, humans have been under the impression that the early universe was extremely chaotic and turbulent. And so to find a galaxy that looks as calm and orderly 12 billion years ago as our own Milky Way does now may necessitate a complete overhaul of our understanding of the early universe and how galaxies formed.
Okay, and then what do we learn from that? We say, okay, our understanding of how the universe was formed has changed.
It's just interesting, isn't it?
It is interesting, but what conventional wisdom is being challenged here? Is this going to ruffle feathers?
So there's first of all the sort of conventional wisdom that we thought that the galaxy was far more chaotic than it now appears to have been at the time at which we can see this galaxy evolving. There's also just the idea that we don't really have a very comprehensive view of how galaxies are born and how they grow, and obviously that's just hugely interesting. One of the scientists that discovered this, who's going to continue scanning this distant galaxy with her colleagues, has basically said that while we do have various new insights in the sort of field of galaxy formation, the history of sort of young universes is one of she describes it as the most outstanding puzzle of modern astrophysics. And so viewed through that lens, I think it's very difficult to argue that there's not massive implications within the field of astrophysics and scientific discovery off the back of this galaxy that we've managed to spot.
I agree with Joe. I think this story is mind-boggling, but I think it does speak to the essence of what it means to be human. It's a story about where we came from and where we're going ultimately. I think the other thing is that the study of galaxies is actually, relatively speaking, very new, and there's so much that we don't know. So before the 20th century, we didn't know that galaxies other than the Milky Way even existed. It was in the 1920s when astronomer Edwin Hubble showed that the Andromeda Nebula was actually a galaxy. Since then, we now know that there are trillions of galaxies, but there's different types of galaxy. But all of this has only recently become part of our understanding, and there's so much more to discover. And I think just to tack on to that, a big part of this story is the James Webb Telescope that will be launched next year and will be a huge story, I think, next year. It's way over schedule. It's going to cost billions, but it's seen as the successor to the Hubble telescope. It has the ability to look at 13 billion years of space, and one of its core aims will be looking at the very earliest galaxies. So it's very relevant to what we're talking about now.
I guess the thing is, Gabriel, people want answers, don't they, to the questions that Felicity was posing there. Are we alone in the universe, and how did we come to be? And we never learn the answers. This is a significant story, but really it's just a further nudge along, isn't it? You have to literally wait 12 billion years. And that can be quite frustrating for people who aren't astrophysicists.
Absolutely. The scale of the universe is something that it is quite frustrating, I feel like, for a lot of humanity. The fact that we can see all these amazing things and they're either long gone because they were in the past, or they're in the past when we view them, or they're an insurmountable distance that we could never hope to travel even at the speed of light. But the thing about the new galaxy that we found is that it poses an interesting solution to the Fermi paradox, which is what the clip at the beginning was talking about. So the Fermi paradox states there's a kind of a paradoxical lack of evidence of any alien life whatsoever in recorded history, despite there being billions, trillions, quadrillions of habitable planets around the universe, judging by our current estimations. There's thought to be at least 40 billion habitable planets in our galaxy alone, which means that there should technically be aliens out there or extraterrestrial life of some sort, and yet we've never seen anything. And one solution to the theory is that we've simply missed them geographically, in that they're just too far away. It's like finding a fraction of a needle in a haystack. Whereas we now may also be missing them on a temporal kind of dimension if we look at the fact that galaxies such as ours existed 12 billion years ago. They could have long gone. They could have been destroyed.
And with that, Felicity and Joe, Gabriel has steered the three of us back again, just after 2 or 3 weeks, into discussing whether aliens exist. What's happening to my show?
I will not be goaded into saying that aliens exist on this podcast. That is not going to happen.
And Felicity, when in the Week Junior, when you talk about that subject, do aliens exist, you can't say we don't know and we'll never know. Presumably you say what most people anecdotally say, scientists, when you ask them, which is almost certainly yes, but we haven't found any yet, rather than there's no evidence. People never say there's no evidence, do they?
We've definitely run it as a big debate where we've posed the evidence on both sides. And I think, I wish I had dug this out before the podcast, but I once read a fascinating article where some of the kind of greatest scientific minds of the age were asked to talk about what they believe life forms beyond look like and resemble and operate. And it wasn't this silly, childish, little green men like E.T. idea. It's a lot of extremely bright minds are absolutely certain that they do. We just don't know what form they would take. If there are planets that are mostly water, they would be more amphibian, all these different kind of scenarios. And it was absolutely fascinating. I think that would be the way to go, is let's not dumb it down and make it into this silly, childish make-believe, like something's out there. Communication
is an issue, isn't it? As we're discovering, Gabriel, I mean, trying to make this story accessible to people who aren't scientists is hard. A shame in a way, isn't it, that this sort of discovery isn't leading the bulletins? Because it is genuinely of significance for everyone, but it's just explaining it and explaining why that's important.
It's a field of very technical science that doesn't have very easy or short or eye-catching answers to most questions. Basically, almost everything we seem to find, particularly in the furthest reaches of space with Hubble and whatever, makes us go, oh God, this asks more questions than it answers.
I think that's probably a big component of the story, is that if it is such huge news with ramifications for our lives, do we have the ways of communicating it to, obviously people will decide when they listen to this podcast, but do we have the language and the ways of communicating how important it is that people take it seriously? Do people know what a galaxy is? There are simple definitions. Do people understand the things that we're even talking about? And if not, does that endanger things like going back to the James Webb telescope, which is going to launch next year? There are so many ways that telescope could fail because it's so ambitious. It will be so far flung into space that even robots can't get there to fix if it goes wrong. If it fails, it would have cost billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, and there would be so much congressional scrutiny that it might be extremely hard for astrophysicists to justify these kind of endeavors. So actually, in some ways, that's key to this story. Can we adequately explain how important and essential this is?
Surely in any congressional hearing, playing a clip from the Week Unwrapped podcast will justify however many billions of taxpayer money has been poured into anything. That is it for this edition of the Week Unwrapped. A big thank you to today's distant stars, Gabriel, Felicity and Joe. Remember, you can download every episode of the Week's back catalogue right now. It is out of this world. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Ollie Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer is Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.